Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Everybody, it is Friday, June the 6th, 2025. I'm not quite sure what's happening in the world. Judging from the headlines of today's newspapers, the world is dominated by a spat between two very rich men. It's not entirely clear what Trump and Musk are arguing about, but all the media is leading with it. The Washington Post, certainly the Wall Street Journal gives the whole of its front page to it. Even the New York Times manages to put it at the top of its page. Only the Financial Times, in a responsible way, leads with Trump's call for a full-point rate cut. It all speaks to what somebody in the Atlantic, Megan Garber, called the short-circuiting of the American mind. We seem increasingly preoccupied with trivia, with absurdity, with men like Trump and Musk arguing with one another on social media. And indeed, in the short-circuiting of the American mind, Garber encouraged us to read or reread a book by Walter Lippmann, a 20th century American thinker, called Public Opinion. According to Garber, Lippmann had already predicted, if not Trump and Musk, but certainly the nonsense associated with their endless drama. And I'm thrilled that we indeed do have. Walter Lippmann was indeed a most important 20th century thinker, particularly when it comes to media, information, and democracy. And I'm thrilled that we have a new biography, an intellectual biography, rather, I guess, than a personal one of Walter Lippmann by my guest today, Tom Arnold Foster, who works as a fellow at the Rothmere American Institute in Oxford, and he's joining us today from Oxford. Tom, congratulations on the new book. I know it took a lot of work. I have to ask you, I'm sure that Lippmann wouldn't be particularly impressed with this question, but it may be the title of this essay. What would Lippmann make of this Trump-Musk spat? How would he explain it?
Well, thanks, Andrew, and thanks so much for having me. So I think, Lippmann was very familiar with media barons and newspaper proprietors who exercised an enormous amount of control over the flow of information into a democratic public sphere. So in his day, we're talking about big owners of newspapers, people like William Randolph Hearst in the United States is probably a kind of analogous figure. And
Rosebud, of course, Citizen Kane, and many.
Exactly. And one of the big concerns that Lippmann had about the American newspaper industry in the early 20th century was the way in which what Lippmann was not the first to call the manufacture of consent had become what he worried was an unregulated private enterprise. And his big question about journalism in relation to democracy was whether democracy, i.e. government by consent, in his understanding, can survive in a time when the manufacture of consent is an unregulated private enterprise. And so there are clear resonances there between these 20th century questions that Lippmann is interested in and the kind of present crisis that has kind of been transformed through digital media environments.
Well, let me rephrase the question. I've thrown it at you, so in a broad way, let me try and refine it. Would Lippmann argue that the increasing, what it seems to be sort of personalized nonsense, trivia of newspaper headlines, serious newspapers like the Wall Street Journal, would that reflect the strength or the weakness of democracy? Lippmann, I know, was a theorist of democracy, and perhaps the most influential theorist when it comes to information and news. Is this a manifestation of an existential crisis in American democracy, or does it actually reflect its health? After all, you could argue both ways. On the other hand, I guess you could argue that these important issues of state are being argued out on social media so that everyone understands it, rather than behind closed doors just amongst technocratic elites.
Well, I suppose, I guess there are two ways you could answer that. In terms of the kind of personal trivia of the spats that powerful elites have, I think Lippmann would see that as, part of the white noise of a democracy. It's just part of what it is to live in a democratic society, is to engage with media institutions that produce this kind of content. But I think the kind of big concern he had about kind of commercial media industries was the power that some of these owners had over what came into journalism and what was published as journalism. And so one of the big arguments Lippmann is making about journalism and about the newspaper industry in the early 20th century is that the dangers of manufactured consent can be met and should be met through the professionalization of journalism. So his view is that a more professional group of journalists are able to produce more truthful and reliable news for a broad democratic public, and that, in a sense, the possibilities of freedom in a democracy depend upon public opinion having free access to truthful and reliable journalism, and non-trivial journalism as well.
So would he be completely out of fashion these days, Tom, in the sense that media elites are trusted even less in some ways perhaps than politicians or billionaires? We're long past the age of dominant journalists. Would he be horrified by the state of media in 21st century America, or the unstate? I mean, it's the bad state, or maybe there isn't a state at all.
Well, I think there are some things he'd be very surprised by. I mean, centrally, I think he'd be very surprised by the kind of sudden and vertiginous collapse in the commercial viability of mass circulation newspapers that emerged at the end of the 20th century. So Lippmann's very much a figure of a print media era that has obviously changed dramatically. And I think one of the things that comes out there is a difference between a form of mass communication that we might associate with 20th century print media and much more fragmented and personalized forms of communication that we could associate with digital media. So I think that's a very kind of stark difference between then and now. So,
I wrote a book a few years ago called Cult of the Amateur, so I'm very much in the Lippmann camp. But did he believe, as some people on the right suggest, like Curtis Yarvin, who is no right-wing monarchist for some bizarre reason, who interprets Lippmann as suggesting that we need Harvard-educated, like Lippmann, elites, the Tom Friedmans of the world, I guess, a few of them that are left, the David Brooks, to educate everybody else about what's really happening. Is that the core of his argument?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I think at the core of Lippmann's thinking about democracy is a particular way of theorizing public opinion and essentially trying to understand how democracy works in the modern world. So Lippmann uses a range of concepts in social psychology drawn from a number of early 20th century thinkers, including the British social theorist Graham Wallas and the American psychologist William James, to construct a new account of opinion formation, which is designed to understand how public opinion is formed and how public opinion governs.
And of course, public opinion was the title of his most famous work.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. So in the book Public Opinion, published in 1922, Lippmann developed a theory of opinion formation that has become part of our everyday political vocabulary. So this book is the place where the concept of a stereotype comes from.
And he invented the word stereotype, right?
Well, the word was it's a kind of technical printing term initially. So it's again linked to the newspaper industry. A stereotype is a kind of printing plate. And the adjective stereotyped was already in circulation in the early 20th century. But what Lippmann does is to turn the noun stereotype into a social and psychological concept for understanding public opinion and democratic politics. So there's this idea of a stereotype, which is something that transmits ideas and images, sometimes reductive ideas and images, and often simplified ideas between different people. And the second main concept here is what Lippmann called a pseudo-environment. That's the idea that between the world that actually exists, this large, complex, modern world, and our opinions about that world is an internal psychological space called a pseudo-environment, where we think about the world and process images of that world and process stereotypes of that world. So this is a way of thinking about how public opinion is formed. And Lippmann kind of arrives at this big paradox that he sees in modern democracy. So on the one hand, Lippmann thinks that all modern politics has to be democratic politics, and that the modern age is a democratic age.
And in that sense, he's right. Even he might even interpret, I don't know, Putin or Orban or Netanyahu as democratic in their manipulation of public opinion.
Well, in the sense that, his view is that democracy through public opinion necessarily defines modern politics, and all modern politics makes some claim on public opinion. And at the same time, Lippmann thinks that modernity poses a series of difficult problems for opinion formation. So the world is very complex. There's a kind of massive growth of specialized knowledge or expertise, and in that context, it's difficult for all citizens to form opinions about every political issue.
Asking in the Megan Garber, in her piece on the short circuiting of the American mind, suggests that Lippmann believed that in public opinion that modern democracy asked too much of its citizens, asked too much of our minds. We weren't really able to grasp what was happening in the world.
Well, no, Lippmann's point is that no one is.
Even Lippmann himself, the great man.
Even Lippmann himself, and the in a sense the point of this highly specialized, highly complex world is that it's not fully knowable by anyone, and so there's this kind of duality that democracy is in a sense demanded by the modern world, and at the same time modernity makes democracy difficult. So you've got this paradox that democracy is kind of the only game in town politically, and Lippmann thinks it's very difficult to play. So there's no way round public opinion, and in his view, politics happens through it.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it, Tom. That's what makes him so relevant. So on the one hand, we live in a democratic age where we're supposed to self-govern and determine our fates through public opinion. On the other hand, we're not able to do that. You subtitle your book an intellectual biography. The more you talk, it seems as if there's a bit too much intellectual in Lippmann and not enough human. I mean, did he acknowledge that we're emotional, irrational beings, and that politics itself is a irrational, romantic business, a passionate business? I mean, we can see that from Trump and Musk. For whatever one thinks about them, these are men who wear their hearts on their sleeves. What did he say about passion, irrationality? I mean, he lived at the beginning of the 20th century. He could look back at the 19th century, see many mountebanks from Napoleon Bonaparte to Napoleon III. Even in Britain, there were rhetorical politicians, shall we put it in a euphemistic sense. And in America, of course, you had Teddy Roosevelt. Did he acknowledge a place for irrationality in politics?
He certainly did, yes. I mean, his interests in psychology were very wide-ranging, and beyond people like Graham Wallas and William James, who I mentioned, he's interested in aspects of psychoanalysis, in parts of Freud, and it's certainly the case that he sees reason as one part and not the only part of politics, and that human passions play a major role in opinion formation. I mean, in his, in one sense, part of the problem of public opinion from his perspective is that it's not ideal public reason. And so a big part of the conceptual language of stereotypes in social psychology is designed to kind of explain and get at exactly these dimensions of opinion formation. I mean, as a person himself, he's very there's a kind of paradox in him as well, in that he's very.
There was a person, Tom, beyond the intellectual.
There was a person, and he's very interested in psychology intellectually and reads a lot of it. But in his writing, he reveals very little of his inner life, and he has a kind of lifelong hostility to romanticism in his own writing. And
is that a strength or a weakness in your view?
Well, I think it's kind of the way he was, and it's a.
Well, that's not an answer. I was asking for a strength or weakness.
It's a strength.
I mean, does that make him more or less a credible figure? I mean, he's presented in your book and on Wikipedia as the most influential and wide-ranging political writer in modern America. He's supposed to help us make sense of our peculiar dilemma today, but is he reachable? Is he really relevant if he wasn't even able to acknowledge his own lack of reason, his own human complexity?
Well, I think, I mean, it's it's a strength in the sense that it kind of enables a relentlessly kind of productive career, and in some ways a terrifyingly productive career. But it had, major psychic costs in his own life, and to a lot of contemporaries around him, he could seem a kind of eerily detached or kind of inaccessible. So I quote in the introduction to my book a wonderful letter from Louis Brandeis, the Supreme Court Justice, and friend of Lippmann's in the 1920s, and he's kind of gossiping about Lippmann to his friend Felix Frankfurter, and he writes that Lippmann, quote, has a definite art as a mind and a pen, but for the rest we must look elsewhere. And I think that's a kind of very, that's a very kind of pithy and sharp encapsulation of what he was like as a person and what his significance is as a historical subject.
Lippmann, of course, like Brandeis and Frankfurter, was an American Jew. Do you talk much about that? I'm guessing that he was the kind of American who was less interested in his Jewishness than, I don't know, Philip Roth or later 20th century American Jews. Did he acknowledge his dual identity? Well, how did he make sense of his own history and the history of his people, if he believed they were indeed a people, they were his people?
Yeah, well, I think I think what you say there with the contrast with someone like Roth is right. Lippmann's born into a kind of highly assimilationist German Jewish family in the late 19th century.
The Lower East Side, nonetheless.
Upper East Side, actually.
Upper East Side. So lots of Jews still around in New York City. It wasn't like he grew up in Kansas or something.
No, absolutely. And he grows up in this kind of German Jewish affluent community on the Upper East Side of New York. And he is personally kind of throughout his life kind of uninterested in religion and uninterested in his own Jewish identity, and writes about it as little as possible. I mean, at the same time, he's navigating a series of deeply anti-Semitic institutions and cultures, and I bring those out in my book as well, and showing moments when kind of whisperings about him behind his back or anti-Semitic comments about him are also shaping his career. So, one moment where this comes out is a lot in his foreign policy writing, and there's he was an object of Nazi propaganda in the 1940s, for example, and he one very striking document I found was a profile of him that the British Embassy wrote in 1939 in Washington, when the British Embassy is writing a series of profiles of prominent Americans, and they do one of Lippmann, and it's a kind of fairly standard account of his career, and then it ends with this kind of stunning forward sentence at the end, which is, "He is a Jew."
Yeah, which suggests what, interestingly enough, another Jew, another immigrant, was Edward Bernays, of course, the nephew, I think, of Freud. You mentioned Freud earlier. Bernays was a pioneer of the manipulation, I guess, of public opinion. What did Lippmann make of Bernays and this developing advertising industry and the ability of mass psychologists like Bernays to actually manipulate public opinion?
Well, he thought Bernays and also people like Ivy Lee, who are other kind of early PR pioneers, he thought these people were dangerous and fraudulent, essentially, and that they kind of greatly overestimated their ability to control the public mind. In his view, public opinion is something that individual citizens can contribute to and have some psychological agency over. And he's a critic of the kind of hyper top-down views of manipulation that people like Bernays extracted from some of his work and developed on their own terms as well.
But he saw in Europe, I mean, it wasn't hard to see. He saw Mussolini, he saw Hitler, he must have seen the way in which FDR manipulated public opinion. This was a reality, an unavoidable reality. May not have liked it, but did he recognize that this was a reality, if not the reality of modern democracy? You talk about this paradox at the heart of his work between public opinion, that nothing was fully knowable, but that was the nature of life. Did he recognize this as the kind of the third leg, if you like, of this paradoxical stool?
Absolutely, yeah. I think he certainly saw people trying to manipulate public opinion and sometimes succeeding. I mean, in terms of Mussolini in Europe more generally, one of the big shifts in Lippmann's intellectual life and a big move from the 1920s, when he's developing those democratic theories that we've been talking about, into the 1930s with the rise of what comes to be known as totalitarianism. This is a big kind of pivot in Lippmann's intellectual life and leads to a series of changes in his political thinking. One of the things that it does is to make his liberalism much more invested in claims about law and constitutionalism, because in his view, he comes to see totalitarianism as essentially a politics of lawlessness. So in his view, states like fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, or from the kind of later 1930s, Stalinist Russia, are states that are not governed by law. And against that, he wants to contrast a view of the liberal state in which the rule of law exists.
So he would probably be very troubled by the fact that wannabe authoritarians like Trump use the law and lawfare so effectively. His name is forever associated with John Dewey. There was a supposed debate. I know you cover this in your book. Why is Dewey an interesting contrast with Lippmann? What was Dewey's critique of Lippmann, and indeed Lippmann's critique of Dewey?
Well, yes. So they are often associated with each other. And ever since the 1980s, actually, when a communication scholar called James Carey set them against each other, there's been a thing called the Lippmann-Dewey debate in all sorts of different fields of academic inquiry. And what this debate does is it sets up an opposition between democracy and expertise. And in this debate, Dewey's democratic theory, which does partly respond to Lippmann's democratic theory, is associated with deliberative democracy, and Lippmann's political thinking is associated with technocracy. I think this is a very influential way of setting up debates about democracy and expertise as kind of framing this a kind of stark opposition between them. My own view is that the Lippmann-Dewey debate is actually quite a bad way to understand the history of political thinking in the early 20th century, and that Lippmann and Dewey are actually in agreement on most issues to do with the politics of the period, and that what's really striking about their encounter actually is how they agree on the need for expertise and claims to expertise to be at some ultimate level subject to democratic control. And where this comes through most strongly, I think, is in a debate about intelligence testing in the early 1920s, in which Lippmann writes a series of articles in the New Republic that criticize and call a fraud a pioneer of intelligence testing in that period, Lewis Terman. Terman is the person who's most associated with the concept of IQ, and he was a leading eugenicist in the United States. And Lippmann says that Terman's expertise is actually not expertise at all, and that he is promoting anti-democratic nonsense in the American public sphere. And what's striking about this encounter is that it happens right in the middle of the so-called Lippmann-Dewey debate, and also that Dewey himself intervenes in this controversy about intelligence testing to support Lippmann and oppose Terman. So the kind of broad conceptual question posed here is, what should a democracy do with anti-democratic expertise? When someone claiming to be an expert comes along and says, my expertise cuts against democratic values, how can a democracy function then? And Lippmann's answer to that question is that expertise needs to be subject at some fundamental level to democratic control.
What did Lippmann make of quote unquote American democracy? Of course, he lived through the period where women got the vote. This was a period of Jim Crow where more than 90% of African Americans weren't able to vote. Did he actually believe that America was a democracy? Did he recognize the profound injustices and hypocrisy at the heart, in some ways, of American democracy?
I think he did. He certainly thought America was a democracy, and an imperfect democracy. He was a supporter of women's suffrage and actually thought that an organization called the National Women's Party, which was a leading early feminist political party, had shown how you could effectively challenge public opinion. And he thought the suffrage movement, through its persistent campaigns and its attempts to draw attention to the issue of women's suffrage, offered a real lesson in how to win over public opinion for an expansion of democratic values and constituencies. In terms of the African-American freedom struggle, Lippmann is one of a very large number of white liberals in 20th century America to only seriously face this issue when forced to by the civil rights movement in the 1960s, at which point he supports the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act.
Did he just conveniently ignore it, or did he never leave New York?
Well, his general approach to thinking about race and racism is to frame it through psychology. So Lippmann's, and these are influential ways of thinking that have persisted down the 20th century. So Lippmann's ideas about stereotypes have become important in explanations of racial prejudice. And one of the things Lippmann says in his book, Public Opinion, is that new media technologies like cinema are capable of spreading racist stereotypes. And he points to the example of D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, a kind of pro-Klan racist epic film, as a very dangerous force in the kind of current social psychology of opinion formation in 1920s America. And indeed, The Birth of a Nation, the film, was a very influential recruitment tool for the Ku Klux Klan at the time. So he's thinking about how racist stereotypes can shape public opinion. And that's his general approach to thinking about race and racism. I would say he's not strong on thinking about what we would see as the structural origins of racism, the relationship between racial inequality and political economy. That's not a focus of his political thinking.
Should we think of him then as a sort of as one of the fathers, if not the father, of elite media theory? You noted that he was critical of the cinema in the way in which it spread racist stereotypes. I guess you could make the same argument about the novel. Certainly many people have made the same argument about television and the internet. Is there a straight line between Lippmann and Postman, for example?
I'm not sure. I mean, he liked the movies and saw a lot of them.
Well, you can like the movies and also be wary of it. I mean, lots of the critics of the internet like the internet, but they're still very nervous about its consequences.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that his view of what the media is that it's not an elite project; it's a public project. And maybe it's helpful to kind of concretize this with a specific example of a newspaper that he spent a lot of time working for. So Lippmann in the 1920s, while he was writing all of these theories of democracy and public opinion, was simultaneously working for the New York World, which was a kind of great Pulitzer paper. It was the newspaper that was taken over by Joseph Pulitzer in the 1880s. And by the 1920s, this is the highest circulating liberal daily in the nation's largest city.
So it would be the equivalent of the New York Times today, is that fair?
Although in it, there are fewer genuinely national or international newspapers in this period as well. So it's more kind of focused on the local politics of New York, on national politics as well. But Lippmann is invested in it partly because it offers real kind of influence on the daily stream of news and opinion in a large urban environment. And this is a newspaper that's also invested in the Democratic Party, the urban wing of the Democratic Party, and a particular form of urban liberalism that comes to be associated with Al Smith, the governor of New York in the 1920s. So it's a kind of mass political force in a large urban environment.
Catholic, of course, that was his.
Absolutely, yes. Al Smith.
Controversial quality. I mean, it's not controversial, but at the time, controversial, particularly in terms of public opinion. Very
much so. And so Smith was this kind of progressive tribune, representative of urban pluralism. And for Lippmann, Smith was, in a sense, the ideal democratic politician. Lippmann was close to Smith, was one of the one of his most prominent journalistic backers at the New York World, where Lippmann was the editorial director and eventually the editor. And one of the thing that Lippmann especially admired in Smith was his ability to kind of concretize small d democratic political leadership to pursue a series of progressive reforms in a large modern state. So he's kind of solving this paradoxical problem that Lippmann had seen in public opinion before.
What was Lippmann's position on FDR? I'm guessing FDR, very different from Smith, a master of public opinion. Of course, famously, a man who couldn't use his legs very well, who was never seen in public, who mastered public opinion, who was in his own way remarkably and successfully manipulative. I'm guessing Lippmann had a degree of ambivalence about FDR, did he, particularly in terms of his theories of media and of public opinion?
Yes, I mean, Lippmann's views of FDR are complex and they change over time, and ambivalence is probably a good word for it. I mean, you know, I don't think it would be controversial to say that, you know, FDR probably is the most talented democratic politician in 20th century America, and that's something that Lippmann sees and can't help, you know, recognizes very clearly, that FDR is he is an incredibly
did Lippmann appreciate that? Did he respect that, or did that make him very critical of FDR?
He was, I mean, it depended on what FDR was doing, I think. So in broad terms,
I mean, if he approved, he liked it, and if he didn't, he was critical.
Exactly. I mean, he certainly thinks so. In the 1932 election, when FDR is running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, Lippmann worries that he's almost too good at politics, and that he plays the game well and likes it for its own sake. But he's also very critical of the current president, Herbert Hoover, who's a technocrat. Hoover kind of sees himself as an engineer and is not dealing with the Great Depression. And Lippmann's view is that you need a political response to the economic crisis, and that FDR certainly can provide that better than Hoover. So he endorses FDR in 1932. He then supports the first couple of years of the New Deal up until 1935. When the Supreme Court issues a series of rulings that suggest that aspects of the New Deal are unconstitutional, and there's this big constitutional crisis that erupts that goes right through up to FDR's re-election and his attempt to pack the Supreme Court in 1937. In that period, Lippmann is highly critical of FDR, and then after that, Lippmann comes around strongly to support FDR again, mostly for reasons to do with foreign policy and the European war that then becomes the World War.
And then, of course, becomes the Cold War. Did Lippmann invent the term, the Cold War? What was his association with the term? And was he sympathetic to the Cold War? Did he see the Soviet Union and the communists, and indeed even American communists, as a threat to democracy?
So Lippmann was not the first person to use the phrase Cold War. It was kind of floating around in the mid-1940s. There's a George Orwell essay from 1945 that uses the phrase Cold War, for example. But Lippmann is the person who kind of launches the phrase.
Popularize it.
Yeah, the phrase "the Cold War" with, you know, capital letters. He launches that into circulation, and he does that in a 1947 book that he published called "The Cold War," and that book collected a series of columns that Lippmann had written that were a criticism of George Kennan's account of containment that had been published the previous year.
Under the name of X, of course.
Exactly, yeah. The famous long telegram that then gets published in Foreign Affairs as the X article. And although by the time that Lippmann published the book, The Cold War, Kennan's authorship was known. And so there's this debate between Lippmann and Kennan that launches the phrase the Cold War into kind of wide circulation. And Lippmann's view of what the Cold War is essentially that it is a period in world history that is defined by post-European imperial competition between Russia and the United States. So his view is that the outcome of the First and especially the Second World War is the destruction of European empires and the rise of the Russian and American empires that are existing in this broad world conflict. And he thinks that US foreign policy needs to manage this conflict in ways that depart from some of Kennan's ideas about containment. And essentially his big point in the book, The Cold War, is that even though there's this big conflict between these world imperial rivals, there can still be, and there should still be, diplomacy and diplomatic relations between the Russian and American empires.
Very, very interesting. Very different from everybody's position at the time. You mentioned earlier, Tom, that Lippmann was uncomfortable, maybe this is the wrong word, I can't remember which word you used, with the market and the market ownership of media. Did he ultimately become a supporter of the BBC or some sort of state-owned style NPR, PBS network where the state distributed enlightened information to the rest of the population?
Well, he liked public service broadcasting, and he appeared every now and then on the BBC. And there's a very interesting transatlantic radio debate between him and John Maynard Keynes in the early 1930s. But what I would say about his view of the news market is it's not so much an objection to the idea of a commercial media organization as it's an anxiety about how those organizations, what their incentives are in terms of news production. So basically, Lippmann's idea of professional journalism is a way of separating off standards for journalism from the market incentives of news publishers and news owners. So he likes the scale and the possibilities of mass communication that the American newspaper industry has. He wants newspapers to be selling hundreds of thousands of copies. He likes the fact that the New York World is profitable, and he wants to use that kind of business model to hive off independent professional standards for what journalism should be.
So what does that actually mean? I'm not clear. So what would he make? So today, what would he say about, I don't know, Murdoch's Wall Street Journal and the rest of the papers that he owns, or indeed Elon Musk's ownership of X?
I mean, what he wants is that the people who own these news organizations need to separate themselves and not influence the journalism.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, this is one of my problems with someone like Lippmann, is that's completely unrealistic. He knew it at the time with Hearst, and it's even more inconceivable today with Murdoch or Musk.
I mean, it's certainly not the norm. I think that's right. But it's also true that the newspapers for which he worked did maintain a reasonable degree of editorial independence from the owners and the producers of the journalism. I mean, these were sometimes tense relationships. That's right. And so there are a few moments where the owners of the newspaper that Lippmann worked for after the New York World, a paper called the New York Herald Tribune, tried to kind of spike or change his column, and he was very angry about it. But there's a sense in which he thinks there's kind of no way back from a commercial newspaper industry. And so the job of press reform is to make professionalization function within it and to maintain as much independence for journalism as is possible within it.
Yeah, I'm guessing if he could see today's media landscape, he'd be turning in his grave. Finally, Tom, we live in an age of abundance, or theoretical abundance. Klein and Thompson's new book, Abundance, is very influential. And of course, it's bound up with the promise of AI. We've got a show in a couple of days with Karen Howe, who has a new book out, Empire of AI, about open AI. Seems to me that on the one hand, AI might actually answer Lippmann's paradox, that we're not able to process enough information, even if we live in an age of democracy. I know this is a hard question to ask. It's entirely conjectural, but what would Lippmann make of AI? Would he be excited or fearful, or again, both, I'm guessing?
I'm not sure. I mean, it seems to me, one way to think about AI in kind of Lippmann's terms would be to see it as, a kind of highly developed stereotype machine. in the sense that it is just taking everything that exists and churning out the most probable combinations of words. And I think that would, what would worry Lippmann about that would be the kind of just the churn and the lack of new ideas and information that can come from it. I think the dangers of it are that it is just repeating and repeating and repeating a series of stereotypes.
On the other hand, though, supporters of AI would argue that you can write into it antidotes to stereotyping.
Yes, I mean, I don't know enough about it, but I'm sure that my understanding is that it's essentially predicting the next word for as long as it can. And I don't know, maybe one day there'll be a kind of general kind of upgrade in the forms of intelligence that it operates with. But I think, in Lippmann's terms, what the threat is of just a kind of relentless reproduction of stereotypes.
Well, finally, Tom, very, very briefly, you've written this book, Walter Lippmann, An Intellectual Biography, and these kinds of books, we're always reminded that these men were prophetic and we need to understand what they were saying. In a couple of sentences, why does Lippmann matter today in 2025, in June 25?
In a couple of sentences, because...
I'll give you 3 sentences, or maybe even 4, but very briefly.
Very briefly, he is engaged with some of the biggest questions about democracy and journalism that resonate with many aspects of the present crisis. In terms of his theory of the kind of core thing that he's arguing is that a free democracy needs reliable access to truthful journalism. And he writes in 1919 that the present crisis of Western democracy is, in an exact sense, a crisis in journalism. And to the extent that we think that public opinion is being formed by fake news or a series of stereotypes, Lippmann's ideas about democracy are kind of in the air that we are breathing today as well. And so what my book does is it tries to provide a new history of where those ideas come from and what they mean.
In other words, he would probably say today that the supposed crisis of American democracy in 2025 is a crisis of American journalism.
I'd certainly see them as deeply enmeshed with each other, yes.
Well, Tom, Arnold Foster, the author of Walter Lippmann, An Intellectual History. Clearly, these issues are enormously important as we look at our headlines today. God knows what Lippmann would make of the current spat between Trump and Musk. It would certainly speak of many of his concerns. Thank you so much, Tom. Best of luck with the book, an important book, and keep making sense of the complexities of not just the 20th century, but the 21st century. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Andrew.